So in this other video, I wanted to address, what do you do when what you have is not optimal? Now my wind set is pretty optimal. Like I said in the other video, my fire set is probably my best, most optimized set because I have some really good fire equipment from the Fire Lotto. This one's not too bad. Everything in it is still wind until I get to my support slots. The thing you want to avoid when you are not optimal is using the superior and inferior element. And as I said before, what I mean by that is the element that is superior to your element. So in this case, that would be fire. I don't want to use fire stuff because fire is strong on wind. And I don't want to use any earth stuff because earth stuff is weak. It is inferior to wind. That's all I mean when I say I don't want to see any inferior or superior elements in there. I want to use the element I'm building for, or I want to use a neutral element because it will have more. For example, 35 wind compared to no wind. Or if I go to Earth, Earth has no wind. But the neutral will still have some wind on it. So if I use water instead, I'm still building towards my element that I want. Again, the boots are what give you the most. I ran out of Valkyrie and Luna boots, so I have the Merciful feet, which are the Magic Swordsman. And then the next thing that had the most element was the Valkyrie head. One thing I should have mentioned in the last video that I didn't was I use the Divine Beast heads because Breaker has a passive that gives them limit break automatically. So I don't need to worry about limit break as a Breaker. But if you're playing an Assassin which does not have a limit break passive, then you're going to want to use the Trial Hat. And the Trial Hat is this hat right here, which has limit break as part of its skill set. So you would use that instead if you were not a breaker. Now all of my sets have similar stats, so they all have similar damage. I see in Discord a lot people will say, somebody will ask, what element should I specialize in if I'm a breaker? And they'll say, go fire. Fire is the best element, or go dark. Dark is the best element. And that's misleading. Because when it comes down to it, your element doesn't actually matter if you know how to build your support slots. When somebody tells you that fire is the best element for breaker, they either don't know what they're talking about, or they're just assuming that you know how to build. When it comes down to it, the only thing that is different in terms of stats is the Divine Beast armors themselves. The Divine Beast armors are skewed to favor certain stats depending on their element. A breaker, which wants to build physical attack, critical, and element, will have an easier time building those stats if they use fire, because fire divine armor is high in physical attack and critical, compared to a water divine armor, which is more focused on magical attack and defense. So when I first got my Water Osiris axe, which was probably back in October, I think. It was a couple months of playing before I ever got my first Osiris, and my first Osiris was actually a bow. And then it was another month after that that I got my Osiris axe. And people told me, oh, you got water. Water's the worst element you can get for breaker. And I was really disheartened by that, because I finally got an Osiris, and that was the thing to have at the time. And then people told me it still wasn't good enough. And now that I've played a bit longer, and now that I know how to build my sets properly, I can say that the people that told me that were wrong. Because when you look at actual weapons, this water axe has 1,709 physical attack. This earth axe, if I select the correct one, has 1,709 attack. This fire axe has 1,709 attack, And I can pull up the Wind one and show you that its stats are the exact same as well. The weapons are all the same. The only thing that is different is the Divine Armor. And so while Fire makes it easier to build off of because it gives you the stats you want, it's not the end of the world if that's not what you have. Instead, what you should be more worried about is making sure that you're optimizing your support slots to build up the stats that you're lacking. And so having water makes that a little more difficult because you have more to catch up on, but it's not impossible. I'm only 2,000 physical attack shorter on my water element than on my fire element, and part of that is simply because this build is not even as optimal. You can see I do have a fire axe up here. I haven't replaced those because replacing them drops my attack by about 300, but otherwise you see I have a lot of water and wind items, and a lot of those are underleveled because, again, I have that side project Water Assassin that eats up some of my resources. Similar, I don't have any fire or earth here because those would not be optimal. But wind equipment does actually have a little bit of water, so where I run out of water equipment, I've used wind instead. So sometimes you don't have what's optimal, but it's not the end of the world. You just gotta make do with what you have and try to use a neutral element to help boost you the rest of the way. The other element that I hear people say is best for Breaker is Dark. That's typically for two reasons. One, Dark Breaker, you get Warsong, and its auto skill decreases enemy defense to 0 for 15 seconds, which means everybody in your party will do more damage. Warsong itself doesn't seem to get that buff applied. I've used Warsong or Mikasa, which is a light version of Warsong that just looks different and has a bit better cooldown. And I only do like 30 damage, but it applies for the rest of your party and they will all do more damage, which is especially useful in fights like the King Crab in the Grasslands. So that's part of why Dark is better to build off of. The other reason is because the Dark Osiris give EP, and Breakers are notorious for having an incredibly slow EP buildup. Typically on an elemental breaker, you have to change up your optimal weapon rotation just so that you have enough EP to buff all the way, which means you're not getting the most out of your buffs. Usually you have to use something like one Osiris, then buff with your Eclipse Axe, and then use your other Osiris, which means you're not getting as many buffs on your Eclipse Axe as you could if you could use both Osiris back to back. A Darkbreaker having a Dark Osiris Axe filling their EP means they can go into their rotation immediately, which gives them more damage sooner. Light, I often hear called the worst element, and it's not because light is a bad element, it's because light is more difficult to build. As you can see, I don't have any Osiris for this set either. That's why my Light and Darkbreaker builds do not do as much damage as the others, is because I don't get the additional stacks that my other elements do. But as you can see, I have the same amount of physical attack on this build as I do on my Fire build. The only Osiris that a Breaker can use for Light is the Osiris Pride. And in order to get an Osiris Pride, you have to pull from the Magician Lotto. Before, anyway. Which means you also have a chance of getting all this other stuff, which is geared more towards magic users or samurai at the time, now assassin. So you get a lot of useless junk for a breaker in order to get this one thing. So for one, it was a lot harder to get, and you end up with a lot of stuff that's not optimal for you. Now, it's a little bit easier. I guess it only lasted a week. Last week was a special light lotto that had all the light Osiris in it as display weapons for the lotto. So it wasn't a very good lotto because, again, there's a high risk that you would either get a bunch of junk you don't need or an Osiris that you can't even use. So still not very optimal. But now it's a bit different because they did just release the Athena series, and Athena for Breaker comes in all elements, and all Athena refill both HP and EP, which is part of what makes them better than Osiris weapons. So now it's easier, sort of, to get a light breaker that does really good damage, but Athena itself is still a really low rate in the lotto, so good luck to everybody trying to get one regardless of whatever element you hope to get. So that's part of why light is not optimal. There is an alternative to Mikasa if you did not participate in the attack on Titan event. There is a light war song. I'm not sure what the rate is like to get this because you have to get it out of one of the random lottos. It is not part of any of the finite boxed lottos. I've only ever seen, or I've only ever received one myself. I haven't even bothered to skill it or to raise its rarity because I have Mikasa, so I don't really need it. But it does exist if that's what you want to try and build for. When Desperado comes out, Desperado uses the Daito, so at that point, if you had a Pride, you can't use it anymore. Long term, you'd be better off using an Athena if you can manage to get one. Again, Athena rates are not very good, so good luck, everyone. So when it comes down to it, anyone who tells a breaker that one element is better than the other is not knowing what they're doing, and that may sound very harsh, but I, quite frankly, am tired of hearing people say it, because it really doesn't matter. All of my builds can do 20 million damage nukes. If I had the light or dark argent dual axes, the thunderclap axes, I could do more damage. If I had a mystic dual axe, I could do a lot more damage, but these are pretty decent builds. If a little bit slow for the reliance on royals. And, you know, you gotta make do with what you have. There are a lot of substitutions out there that you can make for a lot of this equipment. All you need to do is ask. So I hope that explains a little bit some of the things that go into making builds, at least for myself. These are a lot of things that I've learned. I'm still learning how to make my builds better. There's still a lot of things I can do to make my builds better. Please let me know if you have any questions. And you can also, of course, always join our Discord community where we do have a help channel where I and others are in there daily answering people's questions on this sort of thing and other questions as well.